Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Happy Friday. Since the president fired the director of the FBI, James Comey, 3 days ago now, we've now got multiple reports that the FBI's investigation of the Russia issue, the Russian attack on the presidential election last year and the question of whether or not the Trump campaign was involved in it somehow, we now have multiple reports that at the time the FBI director was fired by the president, that FBI investigation into the Trump-Russia issue was expanding and accelerating. And the director himself was involved in the expansion and acceleration of it. The New York Times was first to report that in the days before he was fired, Director Jim Comey reportedly requested additional resources for the Trump-Russia investigation. Basically, we don't know exactly what kind of resources he was asking for, whether it was money or manpower or other FBI resources, but basically he wanted to put more firepower into that investigation. Thereafter, the Wall Street Journal reported that James Comey had accelerated his own personal pace of work on the investigation. He'd previously been briefed weekly on the progress of the Trump-Russia investigations. In the couple of weeks before he was fired, though, according to the Wall Street Journal, James Comey had started taking daily briefings on that investigation. But then he was fired, with the president now admitting that what he was thinking about when he fired James Comey was that darn Russia investigation, that fake Russia investigation, and how much he wants it to go away. Well, now that the FBI director has been fired, now that we have crossed this Rubicon as a country where the president is under active FBI investigation on incredibly serious counterintelligence charges, and he has fired the head of the FBI in the middle of that FBI investigation, specifically because he said he was unhappy with that investigation. Now that we have crossed that previously unthinkable Rubicon as a country, you know, the world didn't end. We still got to do stuff. We've still got to figure out how to make the most of what we've got in terms of our democracy and the rule of law and the institutions that make us the country that we are. And so now, in the wake of the FBI director's firing, we don't know, but there's obviously widespread national concern about what's going to happen to those FBI investigations. Now, longtime observers of the FBI, former FBI agents, the new acting director of the FBI, who was the former deputy to James Comey, they all say that the Trump-Russia investigations at the FBI will continue. They can't be stopped. Nothing can stop or slow down those investigators. Nothing can intimidate them out of doing their work. And that sounds awesome as a pep talk, but of course we don't know that for sure, right? We've never been in this position before. We don't know what's going to happen to those investigations. Late tonight, the news crossed that there are 4 candidates the administration is now considering to be the new director of the FBI, replacing James Comey. One of them is the acting director, Andrew McCabe. One of them is Alice Fisher. She was head of the criminal division at the Justice Department under George W. Bush. She's a very accomplished lawyer, very well-respected lawyer. There is some controversy from her time in the George W. Bush administration because of her connections to the prison at Guantanamo and to interrogations at the prison at Guantanamo. Another candidate is reportedly Judge Michael Garcia. He's an appeals court judge in New York State. He's also a former federal prosecutor and a former INS commissioner from the George W. Bush era. So that's 1, 2, 3, McCabe, Alice Fisher, Judge Garcia. And then the 4th candidate, who is reportedly being considered to run the FBI, is Senator John Cornyn of Texas, which is hilarious. Not hilarious because John Cornyn is inherently funny. Obviously, he's a very serious man. I say it's hilarious because the White House now admits, right, and the president now admits that the president fired Jim Comey because of the Russia investigation. This, so far, has been John Cornyn's public stance on why he believes Jim Comey was fired by the president. Quote, "I've heard what I think is a phony narrative that he did this somehow to squelch the investigation into Russia, which I don't believe there's any evidence of." It would be funny. It would be a laugh-out-loud moment if the White House tried to install Senator John Cornyn at the head of the FBI to replace Jim Comey, given that the president basically freely admits now that, yeah, the reason he fired Jim Comey is, in fact, that Russia investigation.
He made a recommendation, but regardless of recommendation, I was going to fire Comey, knowing there was no good time to do it. And in fact, when I decided to just do it, I said to myself, I said, you know, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story.
So and what did Cornyn say about that? I've heard what I think is a phony narrative that he did this to somehow squelch the investigation into Russia. I don't believe there's any evidence of that, other than the president saying that's why he did it. So we will see who the White House puts forward to be the new director of the FBI. Reportedly, those interviews for the position will start tomorrow. They will start on Saturday. Those 4 candidates will be interviewing with Attorney General Jeff Sessions and with Rod Rosenstein, who is Jeff Sessions' deputy at the Department of Justice. Those were the 2 people who, at least on paper, provided the pretextual explanation for why James Comey had to be fired, a pretextual explanation concerning Hillary Clinton's emails that later was essentially completely undermined, trashed, and denied by the president, who insists it was his decision to fire James Comey because he was thinking about that fake Trump-Russia investigation. So, a pressing question here now, now that Director Comey has been fired, is what is going to happen to the active Trump-Russia investigations at the FBI in the wake of that firing, right? Those questions are made all the more pressing by the revelations over the course of this week that the FBI investigations into the Trump-Russia scandal were expanding and accelerating at the time that Jim Comey was fired. Well, now, because it's Friday night, now there's new news tonight out of Washington about the expansion and apparent acceleration of another part of the investigation, not the part happening in the FBI, which we already know was expanding and accelerating. The news we've got tonight is about the part of the investigation that is happening in the United States Senate. One of the other things we learned this week about the Trump-Russia investigation is that it appears to be focusing more and more on following the money, including the president's own finances and the president's own business history. On Monday, former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper was asked whether he'd seen any evidence that concerned him about Trump business ties in Russia. Director Clapper responded that he couldn't answer that question in an open session because it touched on ongoing investigations. On Tuesday, we learned that grand jury subpoenas had been sent out by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Virginia to business associates, to people financially tied to former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn. In that same Wall Street Journal report this week that included the revelation that Director Comey had started to get briefed daily on the Trump-Russia investigation instead of weekly, leading up to the day when he was fired. The Journal also noted in that article by Shane Harris and Carol Lee that investigators were getting increasingly focused on, quote, Trump's business dealings. Quote, investigators are interested in companies that have done business with Mr. Trump or have connections with him. That could include businesses associated with members of Mr. Trump's family. So we knew that heading into tonight, there was this increasing turn toward business interest and following the money in the Trump-Russia investigation. But now tonight, a new scoop, again, out of the Wall Street Journal. Again, reporters Shane Harris and Carol Lee. And it is about something called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is an awkward acronym, but it is part of the U.S. Department of the Treasury. This unit was created in 1990, basically as an anti-money laundering law enforcement agency. After 9/11, its power was boosted, controversially, according to some people, in part by the Patriot Act. After 9/11, this was the unit at the Treasury that went hard and fast after the financing of al-Qaeda. All over the world, they tracked and disrupted formal and informal funding streams that were supporting al-Qaeda, not just in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but everywhere al-Qaeda operated. So this is a powerful, capable, technically minded investigatory agency that tracks money laundering. And they've got a pretty fearsome reputation, and they've got a worldwide remit. And the story that just broke in the Wall Street Journal tonight is that this unit, this enforcement unit at the Treasury, these money laundering cops, basically, have decided to hand over what they know to the Trump-Russia investigation. Quote, a Treasury Department unit that specializes in combating money laundering will share financial records with an expanding Senate probe into possible ties between Russia and President Donald Trump and his associates. The Wall Street Journal tonight citing people familiar with the matter as their sources. These people familiar with the matter did not tell the Wall Street Journal specifically the nature of these records that Treasury is going to hand over to the Senate Intelligence Committee. But here's the quote from this article that jumps out of the page and starts pointing at itself to make you pay attention. This is obviously written very carefully. I don't know exactly what this means, but this is how the Wall Street Journal tonight is characterizing what's being handed over, what these records are that are being handed over from the money laundering cops at the Treasury Department to the Senate Intelligence investigation of Trump-Russia. This is how they describe the records they're handing over. Quote, one person said that without these records, the committee would not be able to reach a conclusion on whether there was collusion between Trump associates and Russia during last year's campaign. Without these records, you can't reach a conclusion on whether there was collusion? What does that mean? That sounds like a big deal. I don't know what that means. So, when the FBI director got fired, we now know the FBI investigation into Trump and Russia was getting faster and getting bigger. We do not know what happens to the FBI investigations now that they've fired that director. We've never had that happen before as a country. We'll see. But it's not the only investigations, right? It's not just the FBI. The Senate Intelligence investigation into Trump and Russia also appears to be expanding as well. And if tonight's Wall Street Journal reporting is correct, the Senate Intelligence Committee investigation, they're about to get their hands on whatever records may have been obtained by the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And we don't know what those records are. What's the quote again? But, quote, without them, the committee wouldn't be able to reach a conclusion on whether there was collusion between Trump and Russia. Now, Wall Street Journal tonight gives us two more pieces of this that sort of help us to understand where this thing is at overall and what this new information could mean. Quote, Senate Intelligence Panel's request for these records was made because investigators reviewing U.S. intelligence reports about Russian interference in the election came across information that led them to inquire about Mr. Trump's business ties. Oh, really? Quote, a former senior U.S. official indicated that federal investigators are examining whether Russian investments in any of Mr. Trump's properties or business ventures could be traced back to Russian government sources, including Russian officials who might own banks that were lending money to Mr. Trump. So this is new. And this finally starts to explain, finally puts a little meat on the bones in terms of what we have been hearing over the last few days, right? Over the last few days, two things have happened. One, absolute meltdown in Washington, including firing the FBI director with no reasonable explanation for why they did it. So freak out in the White House. That's happened in the last few days. And in the last few days, simultaneously, we have been hearing more and more increasingly clear indications that they're following the money, that they're specifically following Trump's money. As the Wall Street Journal notes tonight in this scoop, quote, this marks an escalation for the committee's probe from its original focus on intelligence reports that were used to conclude that Russia had meddled in the 2016 elections. Now, I'll tell you, doing reporting on this and trying to pull together pieces of this story over the last couple of days and weeks and months, we have heard this repeatedly from people who have knowledge of the Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation. Like, basically, the big knock on that investigation is that it's not adequately staffed, that it might be impeded for partisan reasons because Senator Richard Burr was part of the Trump campaign, and maybe the Republicans don't really want to get to the bottom of this thing. But the main, technical concern that we have heard, especially from people who know what's happening inside that investigation, has been that they've basically just been focusing on reviewing what led to that intelligence assessment back in January that they released publicly, which said that Russia had, in fact, attacked our elections. That had been the real beef from people who'd been watching that investigation closely, that they were only just reviewing the documents that led to that intelligence assessment. And while that's neat, it doesn't exactly inspire confidence about how hard they were looking into the next question, the question of whether or not the Russians had help, whether the Russians had American Confederates who knew about this or were working with them on that attack. That has been the worry about the Senate Intelligence Committee. Well, now it seems like they're working on that second question. And they've got these money laundering cops at the Treasury Department helping them with their efforts. So that's a big advance. I mean, if there are obstruction of justice worries about this administration in the wake of these, deep and serious concerns that the president appears to have plainly fired the FBI director as a way to try to affect or shut down the FBI investigation into these matters. Well, now we really do have to start thinking about whether the other agencies, whether the other law enforcement personnel, the other investigators involved in trying to get to the bottom of this, we have to start thinking about whether they're protected. Or could they get fired like Jim Comey did too? I mean, in the case of the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, we're now going to be seeking real information and real assurances about the independence and the integrity of that part of the Treasury Department. If they're doing important investigatory work here, how independent are they? How independent are they able to operate from, say, the president's hand-picked Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin? Is there concern that their investigative capacity could be affected by a strategic firing, for example? I mean, who knew we would ever need to do this? But if there's going to be a national, patriotic, civic effort to protect and shield from influence the Trump-Russia investigations in various corners of American law enforcement, well, I mean, that means, obviously, eyes on what happens next at the FBI, because the FBI director just got fired, apparently because of the Russia investigation. It also means new concerns and new focus on these crucial law enforcement offices inside the Department of the Treasury that have been looking at money laundering. It also means looking at the U.S. attorneys. Vanity Fair today had a very provocative report by reporter Chris Smith. It was titled "Inside Trump's Coming War with the FBI." It's mostly about the FBI's reaction, the reaction within the FBI to the firing of their director, James Comey. But the piece ends with this note from a, quote, FBI insider. Chris Smith writes that according to this FBI insider, quote, there are actually multiple inquiries in progress. As an example, he says, quote, there's the business side. Was there money laundering going on? Money from these Russian plutocrats that's been washed through Trump's real estate and businesses. That's gotten overlooked. But Preet Bharara and the Southern District of New York were supposedly looking into that. Preet Bharara was one of 46 U.S. attorneys who were suddenly and without notice fired by the president in March. What was notable about Preet Bharara getting fired in particular was that his jurisdiction in the Southern District of New York not only includes the headquarters of the Trump Organization, it's also the de facto prosecuting attorney for international money laundering cases because so many banks with global reach are headquartered in Manhattan. So the firing of Preet Bharara was very interesting because of his remit and his jurisdiction. It was also specifically notable because Donald Trump had personally assured Preet Bharara after the election that he'd be allowed to keep his job. And there has yet been no explanation from the White House as to why the president changed his mind on that and fired Preet Bharara with no notice. But again, today, Vanity Fair reporting that at the time he was fired, Preet Bharara may have been looking for money laundering, quote, money from these Russian plutocrats that's been washed through Trump's real estate and businesses. So where are the investigations, right? There's these investigations being carried out in Congress. There's the FBI investigations. There's the money laundering investigations that apparently have been happening at the Treasury. They also may have been happening in specific federal prosecutors' offices. Right? And we're looking around at the ongoing investigations. And we're wondering how they can be protected, whether they're susceptible to pressure or firings a la James Comey and Preet Bharara, whether they're susceptible to other means by which the administration might try to undermine them that we can't imagine because we don't read that much dystopian anti-democratic fiction. But I'll tell you, this is my last point. There is one other place that we need to look at if we are thinking about trying to protect the Russia-Trump investigations. People who know this stuff are starting to focus on this in particular in terms of how these parts of the investigation can be protected. And that's two specific inspector general's offices. Last night on this show, we reported exclusively that the Justice Department is refusing to say whether or not Attorney General Jeff Sessions has recused himself from any Department of Justice investigations that might include former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort. We don't know if Jeff Sessions is recused from matters involving Manafort because the Justice Department will not say, which is weird. The Justice Department has said that Jeff Sessions is recused from matters involving former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn. He won't say it about Manafort, but he did say it about Flynn. And the occasion on which Jeff Sessions announced that he'd recuse himself from anything having to do with Flynn was when it was announced that the Inspector General at the Defense Department was investigating Flynn over him being paid by foreign governments. I mean, there are Inspector General offices in all the agencies, and they're all independent, and they are real investigative offices, and they're usually staffed by very serious people. And Inspector General's offices are not always perfect, and there are good ones and there are bad ones. But in general, these offices, the Inspector General offices in the agencies, they have a pretty tough record of figuring stuff out, being blunt about what they have figured out when they do figure it out. And it may just have been a coincidence, but when we learned that the Department of Defense Inspector General, that independent Inspector General, was looking at Flynn, that's when Jeff Sessions took himself out of having anything to do with Flynn. There is also another Inspector General who was looking at an aspect of the Trump-Russia investigation, and that's the Inspector General at Jeff Sessions' own department. There's an independent Inspector General at the Justice Department who was already looking into the handling of the Clinton email matter during the presidential campaign. A few days ago, Republican Congressman Jason Chaffetz asked that Inspector General to expand that inquiry to also look at James Comey being fired as FBI director. Well, now 4 Democratic senators have asked that same Inspector General to look not just at the firing of James Comey, but also to look at the question of whether or not Jeff Sessions is actually recused from matters involving the Trump campaign, and, which he said he was, but it seems like he's not anymore. They've also asked the Inspector General to look into whether the FBI investigation into Trump-Russia is adequately resourced. That has all been asked of the Inspector General's office at the Department of Justice. And Inspector General's offices are notoriously tight-lipped. We don't know exactly what they're doing, what they're working on, and we don't know exactly how pointed these investigations are that are underway, but we know that they are underway. And from the point of view of President Donald Trump, independent investigations? Really? If he doesn't like that idea? If he doesn't like these investigations happening in the Inspector General's office at Defense and Justice, he has to know, or he's learning quickly, that it's actually within his power as president to fire those inspectors general. He could just fire them. If he does so, of course, that would be more bombshells. At this point, after firing the FBI director, we're a little shell-shocked. But if President Trump decides to try to kibosh these independent Inspector General investigations, if he decides to try to block those investigations by firing those inspectors general, this is fascinating. Legally, he's got to give 30 days notice of his intention to do so. So if he fires those inspectors general, that gives each of those inspectors general 30 days of a sprint to wrap up their investigations and make their findings known. He's already fired the FBI director. He's already fired Preet Bharara and the other U.S. attorneys. He fired the Deputy Attorney General. Who do you think he's going to fire next?
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.